If you will, open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. That's where we'll probably begin. Well, that's where we will begin and probably end this evening. Obviously, given the topic of walking by faith and the specific characters here in chapter 11, we will be spending quite a bit of time throughout the rest of this weekend here in chapter 11. As Jeremy said, whenever the subject was introduced, I was initially excited over the idea of walking by faith. There are so many things we could talk about. And then when he talked about the chapter 11, I thought, well, that's exactly where I would go. And then the characters, I thought, well, those wouldn't be my first pick. And I had some trouble. I probably sat for maybe a month and a half to 2 months with absolutely nothing written down, because just wondering how in the world am I going to approach these 6 individuals who, for the most part, don't have a lot written about them. And we got down to Gideon, which is here in verse 32. And Gideon immediately poses an opportunity. We mentioned Abel last time, who is mentioned for a few verses back in Genesis chapter 4. We have a couple side references mentioned by Jesus, the blood of Abel, all the way to I would say Zechariah, but that might not be the correct reference. And then a verse a little bit later on here in Hebrews. Now, for Gideon, though, we have 3 whole chapters to work with. But then I was cunning. And I realized that if I simply follow what the Hebrew writer did, I have a fantastic opportunity. He says here in verse 32, "What more shall I say then? For time would fail me to tell you of Gideon." There's my approach. If the Hebrew writer didn't have time for it, neither do we. So just kidding. No, we are going to be spending our time, though, back in the book of Judges. That is going to be where we're going to be heading towards this evening. Gideon, though he is not expounded upon here in chapter 11, he is listed as one of the individuals who have exemplary faith. And there are so many fantastic things to talk about Gideon, and we're going to do that tonight. Obviously, here we are in Judges chapter 6. And the story of Gideon starts there in chapter 6. It goes through chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8. And it would be time well spent to read those chapters with you, but we're going to use our time a little bit differently tonight. We're just going to peruse them. I'm hoping that for the most part we are all semi-familiar with the story of Gideon. So we're not going to take the time to read verse by verse, but I do want to bring out the highlights of the story. I want to point out the things that were accomplished, a quick recap. And we're going to do this in kind of 3 modes tonight. We're going to start here in chapter 6. If you look there at the very beginning, we see that the people of Israel in verse 1 did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And the hand of Midian overpowered Israel, and because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves dens that are in the mountains, in the caves, and the strongholds. And whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them, and they would camp against them, and they would devour the produce of the land as far away as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel. No sheep or oxen or donkey, for they would come with their livestock and their tents, and they would come like locusts in numbers. Both they and their camels could not be counted. So they laid waste to the land that came in. And Israel was brought very low because of Midian. And the people of Israel cried out for help from the Lord. So the setting is for 7 years this has been the case. Imagine what it would be like if you and your family didn't have a steady food coming to your house for 7 years. And we too, like in verse 8, would be brought very low. And thus the people of Israel, as is the pattern here in the book of Judges, cry out to God. And this is where we are introduced to Gideon. And here in chapter 6, this is starting at verse 11, is where Gideon encounters the angel of the Lord. And if on your own time you would like to, I highly encourage it. Notice here that this is the angel of the Lord. There is angels mentioned, and then there is the angel of the Lord that repeats itself through the Old Testament. So my challenge to you, on your own time, figure out when that happens. You're going to notice some interesting patterns, but that's completely on the side note for your own time. But here, Gideon encounters the angel of the Lord, and he presents him with food, and the angel of the Lord consumes that with fire and tells Gideon that you are chosen for a purpose, that by your hand you will do things for God, and then disappears. And so what he is told to do later on here in chapter 6 is to destroy the Baal and tear down the Asherah. And he's told here, do not fear, you will not be killed. And so Gideon does that here in chapter 6. He goes, and the people wake up the next morning and they say, well, where's the Baal, and why is the Asherah on fire? What is happening here? And then later on in chapter 6, one of the stories that kind of ring out from my mind is that Gideon prays that there be a sign given to him. And so he prays for the fleece. And the fleece is wet, and all around is dry. And then he prays again, and all around is wet, and the fleece is dry. He receives two wonderful signs from God that this isn't just something that he dreamt up in his mind or something that he feels that he's compelled to do, but this is from God. As we move into chapter 7, Gideon calls an army at God's request. As we see here, there in verse 3, therefore proclaim to the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful, trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 was there, and 10,000 remained. So we could do the math real quick, and that's just a simple 32,000. So he gathered an army from the scattered people that are now been oppressed and hungry and tired for 7 years. He gathered what they have, 32,000. But if you notice what we just read there in verse 3, he dwindles that down from 32 to a mere 10,000. And as we continue on here into verse 6, he dwindles that down to a mere 300. And with 300 men, armed with trumpets and lamps and swords, he defeats the entire army of the Midianites. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail with that in just a little bit. But that's chapter 7, is both calling the army, dwindling them down, and then taking them to battle. Chapter 8, we find out that though the armies are defeated there in chapter 7, there is a portion that is left and fleeing along with the two kings. The two kings are captured here in chapter 8. They are killed. Then what we have is kind of a summary of what happens for the rest of Gideon's life from verses 22 down through about 28. And Gideon makes an ephod. And for 40 years, as you notice there, in verse 28, so Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more, and the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon. There's a lot that happened in those 3 chapters. So what I would like to do is just back up and kind of go through that kind of bit by bit and point out all that Gideon accomplished. So what we have here is we have in Hebrews chapter 11, the Hebrew writer is going through all these individuals kind of chronologically speaking. Here's all the things that they accomplished by faith. And when it gets to Gideon, he is the second most talked about person in the book of Judges. He has the most written about him besides Samson. And so what we have here, the Hebrew writer says, time would fail me to tell all that Gideon accomplished by faith. So what we're going to do is we're going to expound upon that. We have a little bit more time at our hands. And let's look at what he accomplished. In verses 28 down to verse about 32, we see that he did in fact tear down the Baal and burnt the Asherah. The men of the town rose early in the morning. Behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. And they said to one another, who has done this thing? And after they had searched and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, had done this thing. The men of the town said to Joash, bring out your son that he may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it. But Joash said to all those who stood against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because this altar of his has been broken down. Therefore on that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal, which is to say, let Baal contend for himself, because he broke down the altar. And what a fantastic statement. Here is everyone wakes up and they're just bloodthirsty over their God. And his dad has a fantastic statement. If he's really a god and he's really upset about this being broken down, he will contend for himself. Let him do it. So the Baal and the Asherah is torn down. And if you remember what happened just a couple chapters earlier off in the book, here earlier in the book of Joshua, this was the warning. When you go into the land, if you do not utterly eradicate them, their idols will become a snare to you. We open up in Judges chapter 2 with, and the idols become a snare to them, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Which brings us to the situation we find here in chapter 6. They have erected idols to gods who were not gods in their own town, and they are more fiercely loyal to them than they are to the Almighty God who has given them the land in the first place. So he tears that down. As we get over into chapter 7, I want us to consider the idea here that he defeated the Midians with 300 people. If you notice what happens here, if you skip over just with me real quick to Judges chapter 8, there in verse 10, he mentions the two kings of the Midian. Zebah and Zalmunna were in Kakaro with their army, about 15,000 men, and all who were left of all the army, the people from the east. For there had fallen 120,000 men who drew the sword. So there's the number for the army of the Midianites. We had 120 who fell. There was 15,000 who were left. 135,000. 135,000. What he had initially mustered here in chapter 7 was 32,000. When he dwindled it down the first time, 10,000 was left. So that means the first time that Gideon took away 22,000, their army was smaller than the army remaining in chapter 8 of the Midianites, who still had 15,000 men left. But with 300 men, he defeated the Midianites. 300 against 135,000. I don't even know how to imagine that scenario. It is one that is beyond my capabilities of understanding how 300 men had the bravery to stand before 135,000 in the middle of the night with a lantern and a trumpet and a sword. I wouldn't want a sword if I had to kill that many men. If I had to go into battle, a sword, I realize that would be what they had at the time, but I would want something a lot more. Okay, I have a sword, now what else do I get? You get a lantern. Oh, goody. What else do I get? You get a trumpet. Oh, great. And me and 299 of my men are going to do this. He accomplished it. He had the zeal and the passion and the faith to convince 290 or 300 men plus himself to go into battle with insurmountable odds against them and win. I do not want us to overlook that fact for a second. He accomplished that. As we get over into chapter 8, we see that there's 15,000 who remain, and they are defeated there as well. What huge accomplishments. Not only that, as we get here into chapter 8, there into verse 23. Remember, they had asked there in chapter 22 that we want you to be king, and your sons be king over us, and your grandsons also. And he said, I will not be king. I will not rule over you. My son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Starting there, the first thing that he did was he started a religious reform. Israel had wandered off from their God. And he began by tearing down the incorrect idols and bringing them back to God. They missed the point by the end here in chapter 8. I want you to be king, and we want your sons to be king after you, and even your grandsons. We love you, Gideon. And Gideon doesn't say, well, yes, look at all that I accomplished, me and my 300 men. He says, no. It is God who's going to rule over. You missed that point at the beginning, and you're still missing it now, but I'm not going to let you miss it yet. And then here in chapter 8 and verse 28, for 40 years they had peace. You think about the number 40 and how often it pops up. David reigned for 40 years. Solomon reigned for 40 years. People were wandering the wilderness for 40 years. It is a pretty significant number in the Old Testament. And for 40 years in the time of Gideon, they had peace. That is a great accomplishment. Now, we have just skimmed through chapters 6, 7, and 8 twice. And if you've been paying attention, maybe skimming along or remembering the stories of Gideon, you realize that I cherry-pick the story over and over. And I think that we often do. The story of Gideon is one of heroism. It is one of bravery and courage. It is one of the underdog story that we always love. It is an individual of faith who did things that we would not have the guts to do. And yet we cherry-pick the story because we don't always want to deal with the fact that he has some problems. Before we get there, though, before we get the negative characteristics, let's talk about his positive characteristics. As we open up in chapter 6, we see Gideon, who is threshing in the winepress so that no one could see him from the outside. We have just been introduced to the situation that Israel was in. For 7 years, a plague, that is the Amalekites and the Midianites and the people from the east, have come in and just ravaged the land of their food. And what we see here is that Gideon, in verse 19, meets someone who he doesn't know is the angel of the Lord. And he says, "Please do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you." And he said, "Go, and I'll stay." We find out here in verse 19, Gideon went to his house and prepared a young goat and unleavened cakes from an ephah of flour. And the meat he put in a basket, and the broth he put in a pot, and he brought it out to him under the terebinth and presented them to him. Imagine if you were in a time and a place where food was extremely scarce, how much would it cost you to prepare a whole goat and some cakes? A lot. Even if we in our day and age were to go out and buy a goat and prepare that for someone, that would be an expensive meal to prepare. And yet, he doesn't. You consider the positive characteristics of Gideon to say, here is a stranger, and I'm going to present a very costly meal to him. It wasn't at this point that Gideon knew that he was the angel. It wasn't until later on here in verse 20 we see that. This was before that. Gideon had some really good positive characteristics. As we see here in chapter 6, down to verse 28, imagine what it would be like to be Gideon and be told, okay, what you need to do. Here is the whole town who is worshiping these two idols. And what I want you to do is I want you to take the thing that they worship and desecrate it. Not just tear it down and burn it, but desecrate it with a sacrifice to a different god. And we see the reaction. We see the people. They wake up in the morning and they want to kill him. Despite what would have appeared to be obvious risk to himself, Gideon did what God told him to do. How terrifying would that be? What would your initial reaction be? You want me to tear down what and do what with it? Do you know what everyone else around here is going to do to me in the morning? And we see that's exactly what they wanted to do to him in the morning. But yet Gideon did it anyways. Here in chapter 7, they gathered the 32,000. And as we looked at the numbers comparative, 135,000, you're still at a disadvantage of almost 10 to 1, or over 10 to 1. And God tells you that's too many. Because if you're even thinking about numerically, you're saying that every person has to kill over 10 people for us to win this battle before they die. The odds against that are astronomical. And God says that is too many. And Gideon says, okay, if it's too many, it's too many. Everyone who's afraid here in verse 3, go home. 22,000 left. How much would that sink in your heart to watch over 2/3 of your army just walk away? And God comes back and says, well, it's still too many for me to give the Midianites into your hand. And he says, okay. Neither time do we see him saying, well, please, just a few more. He says, yes, I'll do it. And here in verse 6, we see that 300 are left. And God says, okay, that'll work. We'll work with that. And Gideon says, yes, that'll work. We'll work with that. And not only that, Gideon goes into battle with them. And it's one thing to have faith and say, okay, yes, you 300 men, you go into battle against 135,000. I have faith that you can do it. It's a whole nother faith to say here in verse 19, Gideon and his 300 men with him went to the outskirts of the camp and did this. He had faith to be among that number, to say, I am going to go with them. Like I said, we cherry-picked the story of Gideon. We talked about what he accomplished. We talked about his positive characteristics. And so oftentimes when it comes to Gideon, that's what we like to talk about, that's what we like to hear, that's what we want to study, that's what we want to be encouraged by. But if we left it there, we would do the story injustice. Gideon is a much deeper, much more complex person. And one of the reasons I like Gideon so much is, well, he is far better than me. He has certain characteristics and aspects of me. He's a coward sometimes. He has fears and doubts sometimes. Here in chapter 6, as we see there, we're going to read these verses, starting in verse 11. I want you to ask, are these the kind of things that a man of God would say? Or, since we're talking about faith, are these the kind of things that a man of faith would say? In verse 11, the angel of the Lord came to him and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belongs to Joash, while his son Gideon was beating out the wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." And Gideon said to him, "Please, sir, if the Lord is with us, then why has all of this happened to us? And where are all of his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' Now, but the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of the Midianites." Are those statements of a man of faith? Aren't those statements that if you were standing close to him, you would be stepping back just a little bit? I'm afraid what's going to happen to you if you say those things in front of God. In fact, if you notice here in verse 14, it's one of those weird things that happens when the angel of the Lord is mentioned. The narrative switches to the Lord turned to him and said. It's one of those odd things that happen. Whenever you go back and you look at all the times the angel of the Lord is mentioned, you're going to find that happens every time. The narrative switches to the Lord turns to him and says. He says, if God was with us, if he could do all the wonderful deeds that our forefathers claimed, then why has he forsaken us? He doesn't blame the people. They have the law that says that if you forsake me, I will turn you over to the inhabitants of the land. He never once blamed the people. He blames God. If we skip that and we cherry pick the story and we miss that part, we're going to miss a major characteristic of Gideon. As we get over to chapter 6 and verse 23, remember what the Lord has said when he says you're going to go and you're going to tear down the Baal and you're going to tear down the Asherah and burn it and you're going to offer the bull on it. He says here in verse 23, "Peace be to you, do not fear, you shall not die." But we get down to verse 27, it says, Gideon took his 10 men from his servants and did as the Lord had told him, but because he was too afraid for his family and the men in the town to do it by day, he did it by night. Well, God said that I wouldn't die, but he said nothing about my kneecaps. And he didn't say anything about my family members or the men that are with me. God tells him specifically, do not fear. And the next thing that's said about Gideon is Gideon was too afraid. When we go over chapter 7, we talk about how Gideon was ready and willing to take his 32,000 men and to dwindle them down to 300. We say, oh, he's ready to do, and he's on point. But in chapter 6, he wasn't. He feared when God told him not to fear, and it goes beyond that. As we look here in chapter 6, verses 36 down to verse 40, he tested God twice. Remember, this is one of the very first commandments that Jesus references in the book of Matthew. Remember, Satan takes him to the pinnacle of the temple and says, throw yourself off, because he will bear you up. You will not bruise your heel. And he says, do not put the Lord your God to test. Gideon tests God twice here. This was absolutely against the old covenant. Should not have been done the first time. If God said it, he should have had faith the first time. And he says here, if you will, O Israel, if you will save Israel by my hand, in verse 36, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone and dry all around, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And it was so in verse 38. He rose early in the morning, and he squeezed the fleece, and he wrung out enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. But notice what he says here in verse 39. He realizes he has already disobeyed the commandments in verse 36. And he's going to go back and do it again in verse 38. Gideon said to God, let not your anger burn against me, but let me speak just once more. Please let me test you just one more time with the fleece. Please let it be dry in the fleece only, and on the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. And it was dry in the fleece only, and all on the ground there was dew. He failed. He did what God told him not to do. And then he did it again. And it wasn't out of ignorance, as we see there in verse 39. He knew that he had disobeyed the commandments, and that he knew that God's anger could burn hot against him because he lacked faith. As we get over to chapter 8, we had mentioned this before, that he made an ephod, and we didn't expound upon it. We just said, it's one of the things that happened here in chapter 8. Well, let's go back and look at that. He had made the statement there in that bold proclamation in verse 23 that I will not be a ruler over you. My sons will not be rulers over you. The Lord shall rule over you. What a great proclamation. And yet here, as we start there in verse 34, Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me an earring from his spoils. For they all had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them to you. And they spread out a cloak, and every man threw in the earring from his spoils. And the weight of the gold earrings that was requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of the camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in the city of Ophrah, and all of Israel whored after it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. And then it ends up in verse 28 that there was peace for 40 years. After that bold proclamation in verse 23 that the Lord shall rule over you, he made an ephod that God had not commanded them, and it became a stumbling stone to Israel and to him and his family. Gideon had flaws. He was a coward who had lost faith in God. He was an individual who tested God twice when he was told not to. And then one of the very last things I mentioned about him is creating something that caused a stumbling stone. Yet, when we get over to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, he's mentioned. And we can get into the other individual who's also mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 and also talked about in the book of Judges, but we're going to say that hopefully for Jeremy at another time. Whenever we deal with Hebrews chapter 11, there are people that we love to go to. Moses and Abraham are individuals that we like to because they seem to have so many positive characteristics and so little flaws, and yet Gideon almost seems to have an equal amount of both. The question comes up, how is it that someone who has such negative things against him, how did he make it in Hebrews chapter 11? And the answer is that he is human. And we're a lot like him. Maybe it's just me, and I understand that's a real possibility. My wife tells me that I have a funny brain, and I just think of things in a weird way. So maybe it's just me. But whenever I sometimes look at the stories of Abraham, I think, man, he is at a level that I cannot obtain. And look at Moses. Look at all that he did. He's at a level that I can't obtain to. And yet here's Gideon, and Gideon starts off poorly, kind of weasels his way through the middle sometimes, and ends up kind of poorly, and yet God puts his seal of approval and says, this man walked by faith. I say, okay, that's a person I can get with. I can understand that a bit more. We're not perfect. And the Bible doesn't sugarcoat the people in it. We get to see Gideon with all of his pimples, all of his flaws, all of his bad hair days. We get to see Gideon as he was. And if we were to cherry pick the story and say, well, look what Gideon did. He tore down the Baal and he burnt the Asherah. And he defeated the Midianites with only 300 men. And he brought peace for 40 years. And that's all we talked about. We would fail the story. And we would fail ourselves in what we could learn. But if we confront the problems of the story of Gideon, Gideon was not perfect. Gideon had doubts. And I want us to realize that if we have doubts sometimes, those are opportunities for us to work through those doubts and increase our faith. What happens here in chapter 6? Gideon said, well, where is God? If God was so powerful, why hasn't he saved us? And he is given an opportunity to increase his faith. And then Gideon fears after God tells him, do not fear, and he is given an opportunity to increase his faith. And then he doubts again here in verse 36, and Gideon says, well, let me do this. Give me more opportunities to grow. And by chapter 7, he has it down pat almost. I will take 300 men into battle, and that'll be sufficient for God. He needed reassurances sometimes. And despite the problems, he is listed among the Hall of Fame of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Of all the individuals that could have been placed there, there's a handful of individuals that are mentioned by name, and Gideon makes the list. And to me, that's encouraging. Because I am not perfect. You guys have known me for 2 days. Give me a couple more minutes, you're going to realize that pretty soon. I am not perfect. And sometimes I tear myself down saying, because I'm not perfect, I can't have amazing faith. And sometimes I have doubts. And given my profession, sometimes that is a very taboo thing to say, that me, as a preacher, sometimes has doubts in the things that I believe in. But that's the case. There are times that I struggle with things, and I wrestle with Him, and I spend sleepless nights wondering and pondering and searching for the truth. And I often need reassurances. But despite those facts, that I'm not perfect, and I have doubts, and I need reassurances, Gideon provides a story of an individual who had all the same flaws that I do, and yet had remarkable faith. Jeremy asked why I chose the pattern for how I did for lessons. And I figured tonight would be mostly the groups, the Christians here, who have made it to where Gideon has at some point. I believe in God, I believe that He exists, and I want to follow Him. I don't always do it perfectly. And Gideon is such a perfect lesson to look at and say, well, he didn't always do it perfectly. And he needed reassurances, and he had doubts, and he had fears. And yet he had amazing faith, and he walked by faith. And that's the encouragement for us tonight. Is that if you have doubts, if you're not perfect, keep working at it. Don't say, I'm not perfect, and that's an excuse for something. I'm not perfect, but I can sure work at it. And if we have doubts, that's a great opportunity to say, well, I want to search for what's really there. I want to know for certain what I can know. Use it as an opportunity. So oftentimes people run into doubts. And I find this with young individuals who maybe have grown up in the church, who they're taught something from the day that they're born. They go to Sunday school early on, and then they get to high school or they get to college, and they're presented with what seems to be contrary facts that says, well, okay, God isn't real, or evolution is really the way that we came into existence. And they're told that faith in God is foolishness. And instead of saying, okay, what's the truth? They throw up their hands and say, well, I've lost my faith. If you lost it, go and find it. If you have doubts, look for the truth. Jesus promises in Matthew 7, verse 7, if you seek it, you will find it. If you knock, the door will be open to you. If you have doubts, look for your faith. And if you need reassurances, find someone who's going to help you be reassured. We have a whole room full of individuals who are here to comfort and encourage you in the truth. And because you have fallen in the past, do not think that you have an inability to have tremendous faith. You have the ability. Gideon had the ability. When Gideon was picked out in chapter 6, and he's hailed as a man of valor, that isn't who Gideon is. That is who Gideon's going to be. Gideon in chapter 6 is not a man of valor. Chapter 7, he's a man of valor. It takes until chapter 7 for him to be a man of valor. We can be men of valor too. We can be women of valor, who are bold and courageous in God. And we can defeat all kinds of spiritual enemies, and we can overthrow the powers if we have faith. And because we have failings in the past and because we have doubts now, doesn't mean that we can't obtain that quality of faith. And that's the story of Gideon. Gideon is not a cherry-picked story where he is just perfect. He's a story of a man in progress who has tremendous faith by the end. And so the question is for us tonight, where are we at? How's our faith? What part of the progress are you at? Because if you're at the beginning, we want to help you. And if you're in the middle, we want to help you. And if you're at the end, we want to encourage you to end strongly. If you're having doubts and struggles, don't hide it. Look for someone to help you. If you're needing encouragement later on, find someone to give encouragement to, or give you encouragement. Whatever it is that you need to work on it. Know that it can be done, and it has been done by numerous people. And the fears and the struggles that we have are common, and that we're here to help. If you need to come to God in the first place, if you need to make that initial step and say, I believe in God, and I want to be baptized into Him, and I want to become a new person, as we talked about last night, let us know as we stand and sing.